Deep in the heart of the Middle East, stretching across the rugged Zagros and Taurus Mountains, there's a nation whose story is carved right into the landscape. It's a story of an ancient people, of incredible resilience, and of a promise that was once whispered on the winds of history. A promise that was shattered.
Think about this number for a second. 45 million. That's a population bigger than Canada's, bigger than Australia's. It's more than the populations of Tunisia, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel all put together. A huge community all united by language, culture, and a shared homeland. But this massive group of people shares a really unique and painful distinction.
You see, they're often called the largest ethnic group on Earth without a country of their own. A nation of people bound together by a common identity and a long history of struggle, but without a single flag that's recognized by the world, without a seat at the United Nations. So who are they?
They are the Kurds.
And that name, it echoes with a century-long fight for identity, for justice, and for their own place on the map. Their story is a critical and, honestly, an often overlooked piece of the puzzle of the modern Middle East. So how does this even happen? How do 45 million people end up without a country? Well, to understand that, we have to go back in time, about a century ago, to the exact moment when a giant empire fell apart, and the Middle East as we know it today was born from the ashes. And it wasn't shaped by the people who lived there, but by the goals of foreign powers.
When World War I ended, the old world was shattered. For all the people of the Ottoman Empire, Arabs, Turks, Armenians, and Kurds, it was a time of complete uncertainty, but also a time of incredible possibility. The winners of the war, mostly Britain and France, held the pen, and they were ready to draw brand new lines in the sand. For the Kurds, who had wanted their own autonomy for a long time, it really seemed like their moment had finally come.
But what came next wasn't the birth of an independent Kurdistan. No. Instead, it became the great tragedy at the heart of the modern Kurdish story. A quick flash of hope actually written into an international treaty that was immediately followed by a devastating betrayal that would go on to define their fate for the next 100 years. You can really see the betrayal so clearly when you look at these two treaties. First, in 1920, you have the Treaty of Sèvres. For the very first time, an international document actually laid out plans for Kurdish autonomy and even hinted at a path to an independent state. Hope just surged through the mountains. But that promise, it was never actually put into action. And just 3 years later, it was completely replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne. This new treaty, the one that set up the borders of modern Turkey, had zero mention of the Kurds, not one word. Their dream was just wiped off the map as fast as it had appeared.
So why the complete 180?
Well, the answer really lies in the cold hard math of colonial power, and it's all wrapped up in something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Years earlier, in total secret, European diplomats had already decided how they were going to carve up the region. The lines they drew had nothing to do with ethnicity or culture or religion. They were drawn for one reason: imperial convenience, to secure their own influence, and this is the big one, to control the region's massive oil reserves. This whole act of just drawing lines on a map didn't just betray the Kurds, it basically planted the seeds of conflict that have haunted the entire Middle East for a century. So the result was the fracturing of the Kurds' traditional homeland, a region that for centuries was known as Kurdistan. It was just carved up and split between 4 brand new countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Suddenly, families were separated by checkpoints and barbed wire, ancient trade routes were cut off. Overnight, the Kurds went from being a distinct people to a minority group in 4 different countries, their nation sliced up by borders they never asked for. And this wasn't just about politics or lines on a map. This was the beginning of a long, dark century of struggle. It pushed the Kurds into a fight for their very survival, a fight against systemic oppression, violent crackdowns, and this constant effort to keep their very identity from being erased. In each of these new states, the Kurdish identity was seen as a threat, and the response was brutal. In Turkey, a policy of Turkification denied they even existed. They were officially called Mountain Turks, and speaking Kurdish in public was banned. In Syria, Arabization campaigns tried to erase their presence, and a 1962 census just stripped hundreds of thousands of Kurds of their citizenship. In Iran, any cultural or political expression was severely limited. And in Iraq, things got even darker, with decades of violence that led to the worst crime of all, genocide. Now, when you have that much repression, resistance is pretty much inevitable. In 1925, the Sheikh Said rebellion in Turkey was brutally put down. In 1946, there was a glimmer of hope with the Republic of Mahabad in Iran, a tiny Kurdish state that lasted less than a year before it was crushed. By 1978, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, began a bloody, decades-long conflict in Turkey. And in 1988, the world witnessed the horror of the Anfal campaign in Iraq, a systematic genocide where Saddam Hussein's regime murdered as many as 182,000 Kurds, destroying thousands of villages and even using chemical weapons on civilians. But, and this is so important to understand, this is not just a story of being victims. It is, more than anything, a story about an unbreakable spirit. Faced with all these attempts to literally wipe them out, the Kurdish people fought back, not just with weapons on a battlefield, but with the very soul of their culture in their own communities.
Resistance came in so many forms. Sometimes it was just the quiet act of speaking Kurdish when it was forbidden. It was the Dengbeya folk singers who were like living libraries, memorizing and passing down epic poems and histories through song. It was celebrating Nowruz, the Kurdish New Year, a festival of fire and rebirth, often in defiance of state bans, as a powerful symbol of who they are. Every song, every dance, every story told to a child was an act of defiance. It was a way of saying, we are still here.
And right at the heart of all of this resistance, a quiet revolution was taking place, led by Kurdish women. As Nursel Kilic says so powerfully, their fight has always been about more than just a nation. It's been a fight for their own identity and for their own freedom.
This is what makes their stories so unique. You see, Kurdish women have been fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, they were right there as organizers, protesters, and frontline soldiers, the famous Peshmerga, which means those who face death, fighting state oppression. But on the other side, they were fighting a different battle, a fight against the patriarchal traditions inside their own communities, trying to reshape their own society and demand equality. For them, national freedom and women's freedom became the exact same thing.
And this dual struggle didn't just stay in the history books. It exploded onto the world stage in the war against ISIS. The world just watched in awe as all-female fighting units, like the YPJ in Syria, stood on the front lines. They weren't just defending their homes, they were defending a revolutionary idea of a more equal society. They became global symbols of courage, carrying on a century-long tradition of female resistance.
And that brings us to today. After a whole century of struggle, the journey for the Kurdish people is far from over. The road ahead is uncertain, but it's built on some really hard-won victories that would have seemed impossible just a few decades ago, creating new realities on the ground, and with them, new challenges.
For the first time in modern history, we're seeing Kurds with some degree of self-rule in two really important places. In northern Iraq, there's the Kurdistan Regional Government, or KRG, which has been a semi-autonomous region since 1991, with its own government and security forces. And then, in the middle of the Syrian civil war, the Kurds there created a self-administration called Rojava in 2012, which is founded on ideas of direct democracy and radical gender equality. These are the biggest steps towards self-governance in 100 years. But, and this is a really big but, it's so important to understand that these are not final victories. They are fragile experiments. They're constantly dealing with internal political fights, economic problems, and intense pressure from neighboring countries like Turkey and Iran, who see any kind of Kurdish autonomy as a threat. These regions are really just the latest chapter in a long, unfinished story. And so, we're left with this one big question. The Kurdish story, it forces us to look at the violent legacy of those artificial borders drawn a century ago, and to question the very idea of a nation-state. In a world that's defined by hard lines on a map, what is the future for a people whose homeland has always been the mountains and whose spirit has refused to be trapped by any border? Their journey continues, and the world is still waiting for an answer.